Fantasy football is one of the best ways to stay invested and involved with football throughout the NFL season. And with fantasy football getting bigger and bigger each year, the odds of you getting asked if you want to play fantasy football, whether it be by a friend or family, gets higher every year. So today I'm going to break down fantasy football to its core so you know what's going on and you can get in there and play with everyone else. The essence of fantasy football is creating a lineup of your very own out of players in the NFL or in college. Usually, when someone's talking about fantasy football, they're referring to the NFL. The fantasy football season takes place over the course of the regular season of the NFL, meaning most fantasy football seasons last anywhere from 16 to 18 weeks. The most important day of fantasy football is draft day. It's when you draft players to be on your team. In the draft, you and all your league mates are going to select players. Those players are going to be the ones that are on your team from day one. Settings may vary, but the general gist is that your team will go against the team of another person in your league, and whichever team scores more points that week wins. Once you have your team, you'll have a starting lineup and you'll have a bench. The points you get on any given week will only come from your starting lineup. The players on your bench will still score points, but they won't count towards your actual score. So every week before the games start, you're allowed to switch out bench players and players in your starting lineup. So if there's a week where one of the players in your starting lineup is injured or they have a bad matchup that week against a good team, you can swap them out for someone on your bench. And that's kind of the loop of the fantasy football season. It's checking your roster, seeing which players have good matchups, seeing who's healthy, and you do that for 16, 17 weeks. And a general rule for fantasy football is that settings and rules can vary by league. There are very different variations of fantasy football, and that includes the roster spots and the roster construction of starting lineups. Most fantasy football leagues focus on the offensive skill positions. The very standard starting lineup for fantasy football leagues is one quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, one tight end, one flex position where you could play a running back, wide receiver, or tight end there, and then one kicker, and then one team defense. So instead of drafting one individual player like you do for all the other positions, the defense is like a whole team's defense, like the entire Giants defense or the entire 49ers defense. Like I said, that's the standard starting lineup, but it varies by league. And now the big question, how do you actually score points? The easy way to think about this is if a player I have on my team, let's say a running back, rushes for positive yards, I will get positive points. If a player scores a touchdown, then I will get points. So essentially, if a player in real life, in the real NFL game, does something good, then that results in fantasy points in fantasy football. So things like getting yards, scoring touchdowns, catching the ball, those are all things that would get you fantasy points. So for most positions, you just want to draft players that are going to produce well in real life, because producing well in the real football game is going to produce in fantasy football also. Just a note, in standard scoring, you don't get points for catches, but in PPR, which stands for points per reception, you do get points for catches. And then there are whole variations on that with half PPR, which is you get half a point per reception. Just check in with your league, check the scoring so you know what actually gets you points and what doesn't. The general rule is that 10 yards of rushing or 10 yards of receiving will give you 1 point. And a rushing touchdown or receiving touchdown will give you 6 points. For passing, it's a little different. I believe it's every 20 yards gets you a point, and then every passing touchdown is 4 points. The fact is that quarterbacks just get way more passing yards than running backs get rushing yards or receivers get receiving yards. So the point system has to be leveled out so that quarterbacks aren't averaging way more points than every other position because they're getting so many more yards. And the same thing goes with the touchdowns. The touchdowns are less valuable because they're way more common and more consistent than it is for the other positions. And there are a whole bunch of other scoring variations and differences, but I'm not going to get into all that. Just check in with your league, just see what the scoring is, and go from there. For kickers, it's just whenever they kick the ball through the goalpost successfully, that's all they need to do to get points. For defense, The settings are very different depending on whatever league you're in, but you can just imagine that whenever they do something good, whether it be a tackle for a loss or a sack or they force some sort of a turnover, then they also get points. Whichever team's starting lineup gets more points, that's the team that wins that week. And then once that week is over, you move on to the next week, you get a new opponent, and then the cycle begins again. Now, that's the easier part of fantasy football. The harder part is managing your team over a 16, 17 week span. And one way you can do that is through the waiver wire. So odds are not every single player in football is drafted in your league, which means there are going to be some free agents in your fantasy football league. Each week, you and your league mates will have the chance to add some of these free agents to your team. In most cases, this also means you'll have to drop somebody from your team in order to add this new player, since there are limits on how many people you can have on your roster at one time. Now, there may be a case where you and someone else in your league wants to get the same player that's a free agent. So in most leagues, there's a waiver wire order. This is usually determined by record in the sense that whoever's in last place will have the first choice of the free agents. And then the order goes from there. The second worst team will have the next pick. The third worst team will have the pick after that, so on and so forth. But the waiver wire is a great way to add more talent to your team, add more depth if one of your players got hurt. And that's just one of the things that you have to learn to keep an eye on when you're playing fantasy football. Another way you can manage your team to change players, add different players to your team, is to actually trade with another team in your league. Now, this might not be an option depending on what league you're in. Trades require 2 active partners, of course, and in some leagues, not everybody's active. So there might be a trade that you want. There's a player on another team you want to get. You're trying to get rid of a player you have on your team, but the owner of that team doesn't really pay attention. So they aren't actually going to talk with you and communicate about a trade. And that's just how it goes sometimes. But trades essentially let you take advantage of buying low, selling high, getting assets in return for a player maybe you're giving up on or something like that. So trades really give you an opportunity to flip the script of your team potentially underperforming, and you just want to shake things up. Or maybe your team's overperforming. You don't think it's going to be sustainable. So you say, you know what? I'm going to try to get rid of this player because I don't think they're going to keep being this good. But that's there's a whole other batch of analysis to do on buying low and selling high in fantasy football. But just know that trades are a thing in most leagues, unless people are not active. Now, some fantasy football leagues, I would say probably most of them, if you're getting invited to one personally, have some sort of prize. People will put money into a pot at the beginning of the season, and then at the end of the season, after the fantasy football playoffs, either the winner takes all or the money is split or is distributed relative to the top 3 positions. So first place gets the most, second place gets the next most, and But there are tons of free leagues that you can join for, like I said, free. Probably will just be playing with strangers. You're not really going to have anything on the line. You probably won't be able to trade with anybody because it's a random free public league. But if you just want to try it for fun, there are tons and tons of lobbies out there you can join probably right now. There is also a version of fantasy football where you don't have to do any of this week-to-week stuff. All you do is just draft, and every week your best lineup is automatically put into your starting lineup. So there are some weeks in standard fantasy football where a player on your bench outscores a player in your starting lineup, but you can't move that bench player into your starting lineup after they've already started playing. But with this other format called best ball, that bench player is going in your starting lineup because you don't actually have to set a starting lineup. It does it for you. So really all you have to do in best ball is just draft well. There's no trades, no waiver wire, none of that. You can usually find these on sports betting sites like DraftKings has it. I believe Yahoo has it in their daily fantasy section, and my personal favorite, Underdog Fantasy. Shout out to Underdog. That is the best place to play best ball. They have beginner friendly tournaments that are like $5 buy-in, and then they have the big ones that are like $100 and up. But that's a lot. Yeah, best ball's fun. All you do is draft, and then you can just forget about the team. Just check in, see how it's doing once in a while, and then you might make money by the end of the season. So I've given you all this information on what fantasy football is. How do you actually win? Well, the first thing to remember is that fantasy football is 90% luck. There is so much that can happen in fantasy football, in real life football. There's injuries, we've had game delays, and all other kinds of random stuff can happen. At the end of the day, however you can find fun in fantasy football, just try to stick to that. Try not to be too invested in it because, like I said, fantasy football is extremely volatile, and I've seen people really get stressed out to a point where it shouldn't have gone to, where it's just like it's just a game. It really is just a game. We're just trying to have fun and be invested in football. Just, you know, try not to take it too seriously, is what I'm saying. But, if you are trying to win, if that's what's fun for you, I have a few quick tips for you that'll help you if you're just getting started with fantasy football. I've been playing fantasy football for over 10 years, over half my life, I think. I have a pretty good idea of how fantasy football works, and I hope these tips will help you reach your goal. So the first tip I have, just do a little bit of research. Odds are, if you're watching this video, you probably don't have the time or the experience to create your own fantasy football rankings, to do your own analysis of fantasy football players for the season. So just listen to all the experts. There are a lot of people out there that are doing nothing but researching fantasy football, that are doing nothing but analyzing football through a fantasy football perspective. Just listen to them. You can have your own opinions on players. That's perfectly fine. If you don't like a certain player for a certain reason, that's fine. But there are so many people dedicating their time, dedicating their efforts, and putting out their opinions to the world. So just listen to some of them, find a person you like or something, and at least just digest the information they're saying. A lot of success I've had in fantasy football is because I just listened to the people that knew more than I did. And I'm okay saying that because I just don't have the time. I don't have the expertise, the resources for that. So I'm going to listen to the people that do have the resources for that. So before the draft and during the season even, just look up some opinions from the experts. Just hear them out. Just hear them out. The next tip, it's a little bit more complicated, but just hear me out now. This is very general, but allocate your resources evenly or just allocate them properly. I'll break it down as easily as I can for you. So when you're on draft day or when you're on the waiver wire or when you're trading, try not to overinvest in one position too much. If you have 4 very good running backs, but you only have 1 really good receiver, you've overinvested in running back, and now your second wide receiver position is weak. So you didn't allocate your resources properly. You want to make sure you can have a good, solid starting lineup. Try not to leave value on the bench. Like if you have a very good player on the bench and they just can never go in your starting lineup because you have players even better than them, but then one of your other positions is lacking, then you're wasting value on the bench. And yeah, just don't go overboard in one position. That's that's usually a bad thing. And the last tip I have, which is usually only for people new to fantasy football, just stay up to date. Stay up to date with your roster. Stay up to date with what's happening in the NFL. People on your team might be hurt. Stay up to date with their injury. Find out how long they're going to be out. Find out if they're out for the season. If they're out for the season, you don't even need them on your team anymore. If you're already watching football, you're probably already staying up to date, but also stay up to date with how your team is doing, with how other teams are doing. So those are my 3 pretty simple tips on fantasy football. I hope this video was helpful. I hope it was informative. If you guys want more fantasy football content, I'm 100% going to be making more of that in the future. So hit subscribe, whether you're new or not. I'm going to be breaking down fantasy football rankings and fantasy football environments and all that for every team in the league. So Stick around for that. Hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Goat Stack Productions, and I hope you'll be seeing more of me soon. Peace out.